listening to the London History Podcast. I am Hazel Baker from londonguidedwalks.co.uk. Today's episode is Milner Square through a hole in the wall. In Islington, just off the bustle of Upper Street, a short walk from the Amelda Theatre, sits a narrow rectangle of houses called Milner Square. Laid out in the 1840s as part of London's great northward expansion, it was meant to attract the aspiring middle classes fleeing the smoke of the city for cleaner Islington air. The Milner Gibson family and their architect, Gough and Remew, wrapped the square in a single continuous terrace of tall houses. No grand corner mansions, no breaks in the facade, just one pale brick wall turning and turning on itself. By the 20th century, that vision had curdled. Like so many other London squares, Milner Square had slid from respectability into multi-occupation. Rooms let floor by floor, families sharing toilets, washing strung out over the garden. Between the wars and into the 1950s, Barnsbury and the surrounding streets were written up as some of the worst slums in London, a world away from the Islington of political shorthand and £800,000 flats that we know today. Yet behind the headlines, life here was full of work, noise and community. Richford Iron Foundry glowed with molten metal nearby. The British Siphon Company made equipment in Waterloo House. Caldonia had local women folding greeting cards, piecework brought home to cramped front rooms. Children played in the central garden of the square, dodging washing lines and tin baths, while their parents navigated a London where no one had very much, but everyone seemed to know everyone else. In 1972, Islington Council stepped in with a compulsory purchase order, clearing what was officially unfit tenements and rehousing families in new estates or even new towns like Milton Keynes and Stevenage. New flats came with indoor bathrooms, boilers and central heating, modern comforts that felt miraculous. But they also came with front doors that neighbours shut behind them and estates where children had nowhere safe to play. Meanwhile, as Barnsbury gentrified through the late 20th century, Milner Square followed the now familiar inner London pattern, from slum designation to conservation area, from controlled rents to eye-watering property prices. Compared with prettier neighbours, Milner Square continues to terrace and tight proportions gives it a slightly severe air. Its central garden has shifted from a rough and ready playground shared by working class families to a much more managed and, in part, private space. Unlike many 19th century squares, it never gained the planned church at its centre, an absence that perhaps made the tight web of kinship rather than formal religion the real glue of the community. Into this layered landscape steps writer and screenwriter Susan Oudot. Born and brought up in Islington, whose grandparents moved into Milner Square in the 1930s and whose parents stayed until the clearances of the early 1970s. In her 2015 film, Through the Hole in the Wall, she walks us back through Milner Square, using family memories, neighbours' voices, and evocative objects such as a tin bath, a ration book, factory tools to open up much bigger questions about housing, work, class and belonging in 20th century London. The film has become a powerful tool for reminiscence and oral history training across the borough, helping older listeners remember neighbourhoods that have been transformed almost beyond recognition.
Hello, Susan. Welcome. Thank you for joining me today.
Oh, it's a pleasure.
Now, your film really inspired me to think more about the everyday people in history, because part of the challenge really is when you're thinking about history, a lot of the time you're thinking about ye olden days when things have changed so much in either the last 100 years. What was it that prompted you to create and produce this film in the first place?
Oh, it kind of very much evolved, because when I had the initial idea, it was a very, very small idea. I literally went out and bought myself a little Sony camcorder. And the idea was really to talk to my aunt and uncle, who were the sort of older generation of people who'd lived around Milner Square because of their age, really. They were knocking 80, and I thought, my own parents are dead. There wasn't going to be a lot of time left to capture those memories. And then it kind of grew, because I'm fortunate enough to work in the television industry. So I was talking to a mate who was a director, and he said, "Oh, I'll direct it for you." And actually, he unfortunately became ill and recommended someone else who was our director, Chiara Messinea, who's brilliant. And so it kind of grew, because then Chiara came on board and she said, "Oh, we need a sound recordist, we need this," and we had no money. So we applied to the lottery fund, the history element of the lottery fund, for a very small amount of money, actually. If I'd only known, I would have got asked for more. And so we ended up, well, all my kids were brought in as kind of runners, and my sister did the food, and my husband was the cab driver. So it became a family affair, and it grew from being just my family to other people who'd also lived around Milner Square. And I suppose I was keen to capture it for the reason I've said about, those older people dying off, but also because of the impression people have of Islington. So it was also because when you tell people you live in Islington, they have a view, I guess, from people like Tony Blair and all the film stars we have living here now, that you've got a lot of money, that it's a very posh area. And so, which it is, but I wanted to tell people a bit about the history of it and what it was like to live in Islington kind of back in the day before gentrification. And before all of that money poured into the borough.
Wow. And that's one of the things that I love about being a tour guide, especially if I'm researching something. And there I am with my little clipboard, and I'm walking around the streets just trying to get a picture. And very often, maybe like an old lady or a gentleman will come and go, "What are you doing? What you're hovering around for?" I was like, "Oh, I'm trying to do this." And "Oh, well, my generation, my mother, she was born here." And, and you're talking about how they felt like they needed to clean the steps of the house every day, all that, and it was your responsibility, that the bit of the pavement in front of the house, and all these unwritten rules that we assume the council's going to do nowadays. So it was actually part of the community holding themselves together in the council board.
Absolutely, because in the houses in Milner Square, which I suppose if you were to describe them, at the time I lived there I was born there in the 50s, but my aunt and uncle who were in the film were in the 30s. They were very much tenements in that they weren't even self-contained flats, they were rooms. So with our place, for instance, and we were my mum and dad and 4 kids, we were on the first and second floor, but it wasn't a contained flat. You went to the first floor. There were no locks on the door. Anybody could have come into our flat. I call it a flat, but just into our rooms. And then you went up, and on the half landing, eventually, I think I was about 12 when my dad turned this rubbish room into a bathroom. Up till then, we'd had a tin bath like most people. And then up to the next floor up, and there were 3 bedrooms, which is where we all slept, but again, there were no locks on the doors. It wasn't self-contained. So, and there was no real heating until I was in my teenage years. We got gas fires put in, but it was 2 coal fires basically, and nothing in the bedroom. So it was that ceiling had been very cold very often. And there was, there weren't bathrooms. There was shared loos very often. I think in the film, Margaret talks about sharing, there's one toilet in the whole house for 4 families. So they were very much kind of verging on slum tenements, which again is something people don't really associate Islington with. So it wasn't really saying poor me, because the other thing that comes through on the film is that although everybody was very poor, they were very happy. So it wasn't people saying that they had a terrible life. They didn't. I mean, there wasn't a lot of money, there wasn't a lot of luxuries or food, but it was, people were very happy in that community. And it was getting across that kind of community, which sadly, I think, doesn't exist to the same degree these days.
No, I can see that. But one of the things I think you talk about, where you kind of lead on, is like that use of space. When the council stepped in with the Cavalier repurchase in 72, they changed it all, but the space used beforehand, and also if we think about who's in and out of that space, so moms at home, so we're thinking shared toilet for all the moms. You got the kids either at school or playing in the square.
Sure.
And I think one of the gentlemen mentioned about all the boys not bothering going back to spend the pennies.
Unfortunately, my brother, yes.
That's lazy. I don't even think of
I
that.
know.
You can imagine it, can't you? Going outside and then mom will ask me to do something, she'll make me wipe my face, or I can just stay here outside with my friends and, fix it all. But it's a safe space for the kids to play as well, isn't it? And then, of course, and the men were at work. Yes. So you've got 3 different groups of people being able to coexist because they're able to move around.
Yeah, I mean, thank God for that garden area in the middle of the square, because, I just think women of that generation were amazing. When I think of my own mum, with 4 kids, and before the White Revolution, so you didn't have a washing machine, and, you didn't have a fridge. And so nappies were washed by hand and put through the mangle and hung out. And my mum would go early morning cleaning jobs, and then she'd have jobs she did at home so that, she could be there for the kids. So it was kind of 24/7, because you're trying to keep the house going as well and making, food stretch. My dad was a plasterer, but I mean, these days, plasterers earn a bloody fortune. Sorry for the language. But they do, good luck to them. But back in my dad's day, they didn't. And very often, he was, especially in the winter months, was out of work. So, and there was no unemployment benefit for if you were self-employed. So it was trying to kind of make a little go a long way. And that generally fell on the women. Who performed miracles, really.
Yeah. I wonder what would have happened with all the children if there hadn't been the square, because there had been a church originally intended for that square.
Indeed, there had been, which is amazing to imagine. It was a chapel of ease. So, because obviously the St. Mary's Church, which was the one on Upper Street in Islington, where my parents got married, my aunts and uncles got married, I was christened there. And must have had a full congregation it must have been, the square was built in the 1840s. So at that time, I guess, mid-19th century, people went to church in their numbers, but that chapel wasn't built in the end. But the square, and it's funny going back there now because it seems so small, but at the time it seemed huge. And it was divided into areas. So you had the swings and you had the seated part in the middle, and you had a grassed area at the end. And so people were, playing football, hanging out with friends, doing hopscotch, playing cannon, bulldog, or any of those other games that and it was the whole square, all the kids from the square. So it was a large number. You were never short of somebody to play with.
Yeah, what a great feeling that would be. Just out in the world, you're net free, but you know that you're going to be meeting friends there. I think there's something that you mentioned in the film, and you just touched on it about this, community. I think it was your uncle was talking about having parties in the house, fitting 30 or 40 people in. And that kind of linked my thoughts with when you were mentioning about the community at the church, all the weddings and all the christenings. So assuming they wouldn't need the church hall, they'd come back to the square where all the extended family and neighbours, stroke friends were, and had a little bit of a need up there.
Well, very often, yeah. I think there were a couple of. I remember my Aunt Pat, who's in the film. I was her bridesmaid, and I remember her wedding. I was about 5, but that was in some kind of church hall, I think. But very often, especially at Christmas time or at those occasions, there would be huge numbers of people there, and it would be music and playing cards and kids, up all hours, nicking bits of alcoholic drinks from the table when nobody was looking. It's that kind of thing. And then on Boxing Day, if the Arsenal had a home match, we'd all go to the Arsenal. And so it was great times.
Oh, and you call the film Through the Hole in the Wall.
Yeah.
Do you want to explain to the listeners what that means?
Yeah, there was literally a kind of a long alleyway that was built between two of the houses that linked Milner Square with Almeida Street on the other side, and it was a cut through. And at that time, it's no longer there actually, and the alleyway is there, but there used to be a front door halfway down the alleyway. So somebody's front door was there. I mean, in this black space, people I know actually, and it was just a rather forbidding kind of place because it was so dark. So I'd literally go up if it was nighttime if I was out with friends, I'd have to think twice about going home that way. But I'd get up to the end of the alleyway in Almeida Street and literally run through it till you get to the other side. And there's a sense of safety because it's what you know and all the people in it. And I think it was something else that, in a way, my uncle touched on in the film, that the world we lived in was very small. I think, nobody owned a car. We didn't really have that many holidays because there wasn't much money. And so the world you inhabited was much smaller than the one that generally people have these days. So it was very much concentrated on the square and the walk to school. I went to Laycock School, which, is a 10-minute walk away along Liverpool Road. And that was the kind of journey that you did regularly, but there weren't that many others. I had a dodgy eye when I was a kid, and I remember going on the bus to Moorfields Eye Hospital in City Road. And that was exotic. And I remember being on the top. We sat on the top of the bus, and it went over the canal, and it was like, oh my God! It was like going to the seaside, see a stretch of water. So I think that our kind of experiences were ridiculously kind of few in comparison with what most kids had these days.
And looking back now, because it's 10 years since it launched, what are your fondest memories from making the film?
From making the film, I think it was my aunt, who's since died, on film, and my uncle, who's very poorly, is on the film, and Doris, who was a neighbour whose kids I used to play with and when I was a kid, has since died. So I feel very pleased that I was able to kind of capture a bit of their stories, really. And because, as you said before, that kind of sense of oral history that, we stand to lose a lot of that. And these things are done. I mean, someone said to me after I did this one, oh, what's the next one you're going to do? And it was like, oh my gosh. Because it was like we were filming with octogenarians in 85-degree heat. It's not easy. And we had to beg, steal and borrow. People were so generous and gave the editor work for nothing, the director work for nothing. People were brilliant because we had a proper ITV who I work for us. Loaned us all the equipment. We had professional equipment. The screen on the green in Islington, we had our premiere there. The recording studio that's on Upper Street, where I think Kylie had been the day before recording her Christmas song. I went in there and they gave us a studio to do some voiceover. People were fantastic, but it's like a full-time job doing it. But it is something I'm very proud of, and I'm very glad I did.
Yeah. Yeah, talking about, it sounds like you built your own community during this project.
Well, it was interesting going back to Milner Square as well. So the thing when you get lottery funding is that there are various things that you have to comply with. And one of those was involving people who lived in Milner Square now, none of whom I knew, and other groups, interested groups. So we ended up as quite a weird band in the end, because we had Age UK involved, we had the Veterans Association involved, and I put on an event at the Islington Town Hall, and we leafleted Milner Square and asked people to come along. And the current residents, many of whom were brilliant, because they allowed us access to their homes. Now, without that, there would have been no kind of comparison for us to make. So yeah, there were lots of people who I was very privileged to kind of work with on it. And one of whom was actually Julie Melrose from the Islington History Museum, local history museum. And they were brilliant because we had use of their archive. And that was fantastic, going through the archive and seeing lots of old photographs of Islington. And I think our stuff is now in there as part of their archive. So yeah, it was a great experience, tiring but great.
And of all the subjects that you covered, what was the thing that you were surprised about the most?
I don't think I was surprised by people's responses in terms of the fact that growing up there was a very happy experience, because I think that everybody loves that sense of community and safety, really. I think especially now in what's a kind of fairly scary world, to have that sense that there were always people looking out for you. So I wasn't surprised by that. I suppose some of the individual stories, Brian, who I didn't know growing up, he's a bit older than me. My oldest brother knew him, but he'd had a very poor childhood. And sadly, his dad died a couple of months before Brian was born. So he never knew his dad. And his stepdad, I think, wasn't that keen on, the kids. And he'd had a really hard time. So that was a bit of an eye-opener, really, because although we had no money, we had a loving family, extended family. So when we had no money, my nan, who ran a Christmas club, where my aunts and my mum would put in 2 and 6 a week, and, then you'd have food for Christmas. So, but also use that as some money you could borrow during the year and you could pay it back. So hard, nobody really went to a bank. We didn't have bank accounts. But Brian's was very poor. And that kind of surprised me because, we lived in that same environment. And Margaret, who lives then still, Margaret Crown, who was in the film, has lived there all her life. And she now lives on a block that was built, I think it was built in the 70s after the council took over Milner Square, and was on the site of the old Richmond foundry. She has only ever known Milner Square, and her dad died there. And that was quite a shocking story as well. The fact that somebody has a heart attack, you run to the doctor and the doctor won't come, and you go to the place. It's like that life was, the value on it was so much less, I think, that came through Brian and Margaret's stories. And I think in making the film, in a way, it's, even though she says she walks through the square every day, it made her re-look, if you like, and remember what it was like. And when her dad died, for instance, they had 2 floors. There were 3 children and her parents, and they rented rooms on 2 floors. But when her dad died, they had no income. There was no money. So they had to give up one of the floors, and they were all 3 girls and her mum. I mean, they slept 2 in the bed in the 2 rooms upstairs. That was the kitchen and the living room and so on. So it was those kinds of hardships that continued into a time when you just thought that things were better.
And quality of life is so much different now, isn't it? You know, children expect their own room, let alone their own bed.
With a TV.
You know, my mum would talk to me about, yes, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, my mum would talk about sharing the 1 bedroom that she and her sister shared and shared the same bed. And that was just normal growing up.
I think until I left home, I'd never had my own bedroom. I mean, I was either, I was in with my brother when we were little, then my sister. And then when my eldest brother got married and he came to live with us temporarily, and my parents gave him their bed. And so at one point, at the other bedroom, there were my parents, my brother and me, just in 1 bedroom. So, it was kind of par for the course. So you wouldn't think of yourself as deprived or anything like that. It was just, that's just what happened. So, yeah.
Some of the stories that kind of I was surprised about, but it was also heartwarming, is about the practicality of the fathers, especially during wartime, and strengthening the house so all the family could be together.
Yeah. So that was my granddad, who my aunt remembers him putting tree trunks in. He was quite resourceful, was my grandfather, putting tree trunks in the living room. I mean, I'm not sure how effective they would have been, to be honest with you, because I think the old lath and plaster ceilings probably would have caved in pretty quickly. But yeah, trying to prop up the ceilings and having the kids there so they didn't go off, they weren't evacuated, and they stayed in the square. And I know people had very difficult decisions to make at that time, and whether you kept your kids around you or not. But fortunately, they were safe. But there was a lot of bombing in and around that area. And as my uncle says in the film, that, you turned up for school sometimes and kids didn't arrive. So, yeah, it was an area that kind of then got rebuilt in certain areas. And I think there was a very forward-looking head of planning at Islington Council at that time. Well, not during the war, but after the war and leading up to the council purchasing Milner Square, who didn't opt for the solutions that a lot of other London boroughs that had been bombed had taken, which was to build high-rise blocks of flats. There were very few flats. I mean, if you look at Islington now, there are very high-rise blocks, if any. I mean, you'd barely call them high-rise. And so the interesting thing about Milner Square, or all the squares really, is that they were very mixed, because the Islington Council wanted to keep council tenants in these street properties rather than in these big high-rises. So still today you have squares that are very mixed in terms of being privately owned, housing association and council. So the demographic is a very mixed demographic in Islington, living cheek by jowl.
Yeah, I do think it was under the pressure post-war with a big housing shortage. Yeah, the easiest thing to do was to knock up a high rise and just get everybody into that. And so, yeah, building these flats that also look like houses as well, and keeping that small square nature was a very good idea, I think. I mean, the square visually has changed a lot, hasn't it? From looking at old photos
It's a
to what it looks now.
It's a very unusual square. The architects were slightly eccentric, I think, and I think another example of their work is just down in Armida Street towards the end where the Armida Theatre is now. And it's not quite brutalist, but it's a very unusual kind of architecture. And it's quite a beautiful square now because the council, which is still the freeholder of that square, maintain it very well. But after, a period of time with people using coal as their main source of heating, you had the brickwork in Milner Square was blackened. And because of this less than ornate architecture that other squares in Islington enjoy, it did have a rather foreboding kind of look to it. So you had the blackened brickwork and the peeling paint on the doors and so on. So it did look like you'd walked into a kind of Dickensian film. But nowadays it actually looks pretty good, I think, and is an example of. I mean, a lot of, obviously, the demographic of Islington became partly as it is because of people buying under the right to buy under Thatcher. So Milner Square is very like that, where you have private flats and council flats, and it's a very mixed area.
And visually, it's very different. Say, like Lonsdale Square, your next door neighbour in terms of. But I think also it's the scale of things. So not just the pretty architecture, you've got a lot plainer architecture, but also it's like a lozenge rather than a square, isn't it? It's long and thin. And I suppose that, and imagine that with the church in as well. No one who got any lights.
Would have been, yes, it would have been quite a sight. Yeah, it is a bit like that. And I think it's the height of the buildings that accentuates that because there are basements and then 4 floors. So it's that they're very tall buildings. And because the upper floors, the first floor in particular, would have been where the drawing room would have been. So the ceilings were incredibly high with, marble fireplaces and cornices. And so it was a very, very tall building. Unlike, as you say, with Lonsdale Squares, is a Gothic architecture. Gibson Square built not that far away in time to Milner Square. And in fact, some of the material we used in the documentary was actually taken from an excellent 6-part series that the BBC did back in the 1960s called 6 Sides of the Square. I'd recommend anyone to check it out if you can in an archive. And it was about the emerging kind of gentrification of places like Islington, where it showed you solicitors and doctors moving in and cleaning out their cornices and so on. And down in the basement next door would be some little old lady with no heating, living in abject poverty. So, and it covered a different subject each episode. But that was a brilliant piece of documentary footage that we drew from for ours.
I'll link the 6 Sides of the Square as well. It's on the BBC Archive website, I think. Still, if they haven't moved it, they'll be able to get a better idea of what real London was like.
I suppose it's that sense of residential being kind of cheek by jowl with industry, which we had with the iron foundry, but also with it was one factory, but at one time it was the siphon factory. You remember, like James Bond with his whiskey and soda or whatever.
And Cordonia as well, wasn't it? A greeting card.
And in fact, the nieces of the guy who owned the Cordonia were the ones who gave us the footage of the women that were inside folding the cards. Right. And a number of people, women mainly, or probably exclusively, from the square who worked in factory industries, at least, to earn money again.
And bringing work home with them as well.
Oh, yeah. I remember my mum doing padded hangers and, and something with loads of glitter. I remember that. And it was different homework just to kind of try and supplement your income whilst juggling kids, because it was your extended family again who looked after your kids if you worked. So that was the other beauty, I guess, for having that set up round, well, in any community, but round Milner Square at that time.
And for yourself, you said you were born in Milner Square. So what family did you have connected together on that street?
On Milner. So my both my maternal and paternal grandparents lived there. So one of my nans lived at 35 and my other nan lived at 49. We lived at 41. And my aunt, Pat, who's in the film, she lived at 33. But she took over that flat from my uncle Ronnie, who was at 33 and then moved out to Aylesbury. And then my other aunt, my great aunt lived on the other side of the square at one point. My great aunt Charlotte and my aunt Doris and my uncle George lived over there, other side of the square as well. So, when my parents met in the square, that's where they met and they got married. I mean, my mum was 18 and, my dad was 20. And then he went off to war, shortly after that. So we had, but a lot of families. Doris, who I interview in the film, she had, both her brothers lived on the square with their families. They had a large number of kids. So there was a lot of that, it was like the Oudots or the Brennans, and it was like a little tribe. So I suppose when people heard of flats becoming vacant, they told their family members and they'd go to Dove Brothers, who were the people who you paid the rent to. You just say, have you got a flat? It's not like today where kids can't get properties in Islington for love nor money. My dad always used to tell the story of how I was probably in the 60s, that they were trying to offload the properties because they were in such a state of disrepair. It's too expensive to put them right. And they were £4,000. But of course, it might just as well have been 4 million, because there's no way we could have, £4,000. So it did take a lot, that company that bought the square and did nothing with it for a long time, and they were just rented out and allowed to go into an even greater state of disrepair until council bought them under the compulsory purchase order.
Yeah, it's amazing also how, I suppose, families moved away at that time as well, Milton Keynes, etc.
Yes.
I was on Highbury Fields and I was just walking along the crescent there, and there's an older lady. She said she used to live on Highbury Fields and with her family, and they were just falling apart. Once again, could offer the opportunity to buy it, but no chance.
Yes.
You might as well say go and live on the moon. Yeah. And so now, of course, that's in, 4 weddings and a funeral, a really beautiful facade, but that was crumbling down then as well. So all these places that look nice and posh, if they're old, then they've got a story, and those stories are peoples and communities in them.
Yeah.
So yes, lots of change in Islington. And having lived, living there yourself and raising your 4 daughters, have you seen that a type of community change where you are?
Yeah, I have. I mean, when we left Milner Square, we moved on to a council estate, which was off of Caledonian Road, which had just been built. And my grandmother, who was living in Milner Square, was desperate to go there because it had a bathroom. Because for her, she was on the 3rd floor in Milner Square and the toilet was down by the garden. So we moved to this council estate. And then at some point I moved into a flat in Thornhill Road, and my husband moved in. And then when we were looking to buy somewhere, we couldn't afford Islington, so we moved to Stoke Newington. And my dad thought I was mad. It was like, at that time, it was like Stoke Newington High Street was Muggers Mile, and it was, So anyway, we managed to buy a house because nobody wanted to live there. £31,000 for a 5-bedroom house. And eventually we moved, after we had our 4th daughter, we moved back to Islington, to a house that was semi-derelict. It's the story of our lives. But I live in a square now. Mostly they are flats. It's 4 flats in a house or whatever. And we've got residents associations and whatnot, but I don't know that many people. I suppose my kids, possibly that's another thing. Well, no, actually, no, I did have young kids when we moved to this place, but I think it is different. Yeah, I think people kind of keep themselves to themselves a bit more now. And I'm always, when I go up north to work, I'm always defending the south because people say we're so unfriendly and so on. And that, everyone in Manchester is so jolly. Then then sometimes I think, probably, they're not wrong in some respects. But I think there are lots more problems in London, and I think people are never quite sure, what they might get themselves into. So I think in some little streets there's probably that same sense of community, but I'd say it's not as widespread as it was.
I think you're right. I live in a Victorian terrace and really only see the neighbours when we all put our bins out. Otherwise, we're inside.
But I think that is the other thing, isn't it? That a lot more women were at home during that time. And so, and it was like you said early on, even though they were kind of slums and we didn't own them, women were out there with their tub of Vim scrubbing the front steps every week. It was, you take it in turns. And my nan's, the lino in my nan's hallway, it was like an ice skating rink. So
yeah, same in mine.
They were all at home, or they were hanging out the washing, or doing the windows and so on, and going to the local shop. There was in Islington, because I've worked in so many shops in Islington growing up, whether it's Marks and Spencer's, Clark's, the Bakers, the Wimpy, the Bookies, but there wasn't a Sainsbury's. There weren't those big supermarkets. And so people went to the local grocery shop on Barnsbury Street and the sweet shop next door to get their tobacco and whatever. So there was a lot more interaction with local people. And I think that perhaps has gone a little bit.
And where was the local boozer? Which one was the go-to for Milner Square?
Neither of my parents drank. I think my mum got drunk on port when she was about 19, and she came home with a turkey under her arm or something for Christmas time. And she never drank after that. And my dad didn't really drink. So we kind of didn't go to the boozers that much. I know kids who did sat outside with a packet of crisps. But I think I don't know which ones people used really.
Right. Yeah, what a fantastic way to remember just a little pocket of London life.
Yeah.
And thank you so much for talking about your experiences with this film and sharing your family stories as well. I wish more people did it. Because we're gonna lose so much if we don't.
Indeed. Yeah.
Thank you, Susan. That's been absolutely wonderful.
You're very welcome.